Josh Freeman was halfway through his third set of deadlifts when his phone buzzed on the bench beside him. He ignored it, his focus on the weight in his hands, the bar bending slightly under the plates. The gym was nearly empty, save for a few regulars who shared his dedication to the early morning grind. This was his time, an hour of solitude before the world woke up, before the demands of work and home took over. As he finished the set, he dropped the bar with a satisfying thud, wiping the sweat from his brow. His chest heaved with the effort, but a grin tugged at the corner of his lips. The satisfaction of pushing his limits never got old. He reached for his phone, expecting to see the usual morning texts from his wife, Megan. They had a routine. She'd message him as soon as she was up, usually something sweet or a reminder about the day's plans. But when he unlocked the screen, there was no text from Megan. Instead, there was a missed call from an unknown number. Josh frowned. It was unusual for anyone to call him this early, let alone from a number he didn't recognize. He considered calling back but decided against it. If it was important, they'd leave a message. He set the phone back down and moved on to his next exercise, pushing the thought out of his mind. By the time he finished his workout and showered, the gym was starting to fill up. The missed call still nagged at him, though. As he walked to his car, he checked his phone again. Still no message. He debated whether to mention it to Megan, but she was probably already up and getting ready for her own busy day. She was always on top of things, rarely missing a beat. It was one of the things he loved about her. Josh tossed his gym bag into the back seat and slid into the driver's seat, firing up the engine. The day had barely begun, but his mind was already racing through the tasks ahead. The missed call could wait. He had a full schedule at the office and a lunch meeting with a potential new client that he couldn't afford to mess up. As he pulled out of the parking lot, Josh's thoughts drifted to Megan. They'd been married for 5 years, and despite the occasional bump, their relationship was solid. They were the couple that others envied. At least, that's what people told them. He knew how lucky he was to have her. Megan was beautiful, smart, and driven. She worked as an interior designer, and her business was thriving. Their lives were busy, but they made time for each other, always finding a way to reconnect, whether it was over dinner or a weekend getaway. But lately, something had been different. Josh couldn't put his finger on it, but he'd noticed a subtle shift in Megan. She was more distant, more distracted. He'd chalked it up to stress. Her work had been demanding, and they'd both been putting in long hours. They'd talked about starting a family, but the timing never seemed right. Maybe that was part of it, too. He knew Megan wanted kids, and so did he. But it always felt like there was something else they needed to do first. As he drove, the memory of the missed call faded, replaced by thoughts of the day ahead. But the seed of doubt had been planted, small and barely noticeable, buried beneath the surface of his otherwise content life. He had no idea how quickly it would grow. It was Friday evening when Josh pulled into the driveway of their suburban home, the sunset casting long shadows across the front lawn. He was looking forward to the weekend. 2 days to unwind, maybe catch a game with friends, and spend some quality time with Megan. She'd mentioned wanting to go for a hike, and though Josh wasn't much of an outdoorsman, he'd agreed. He knew how much she loved nature, and besides, he enjoyed watching her in her element, carefree and happy. As he opened the front door, the aroma of something delicious hit him immediately. Megan was in the kitchen, humming softly as she moved around, stirring a pot on the stove. She was dressed casually, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she looked up with a smile as he walked in. "Hey, you!" she greeted him, wiping her hands on a towel before walking over to give him a quick kiss. "How was your day?" "Long," Josh replied, returning the kiss and wrapping an arm around her waist. "But it's a lot better now." Megan laughed and pulled away, her eyes twinkling. "I made your favorite, spaghetti carbonara. I figured we could have a nice dinner tonight, just the two of us. We haven't had much time together lately." Josh's heart swelled with affection. "That sounds perfect." He glanced around the kitchen, noticing the wine glasses on the counter. Celebrating something? Just celebrating us, Megan said, her smile widening. I thought it'd be nice to take a break from everything, you know? Disconnect for a bit. Josh nodded, appreciating the gesture. They both needed this, a quiet evening at home, away from the pressures of work and the world. I'm all for it. Let me just grab a shower and I'll be right down. As he headed upstairs, Josh felt a warmth that had been missing lately. Maybe things had just been too hectic, and they'd let the little moments slip by. Tonight was a chance to reconnect, to remind each other of what they had. When he came back down, freshly showered and dressed in comfortable clothes, Megan had already set the table. A bottle of red wine was breathing, and the spaghetti was steaming in a large bowl at the center. They sat down, and for a while, they simply enjoyed the meal, talking about their days and the plans for the weekend. So, I was thinking, Megan said as she twirled her fork in the pasta, maybe we could go up to the cabin tomorrow, just for the night. It's been a while since we've had a real getaway. Josh paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. The cabin was a small place they'd rented a few times, nestled in the woods a couple of hours away. It was peaceful, isolated, a perfect retreat. But something about the sudden suggestion caught him off guard. Tomorrow? He repeated, searching her face. Yeah, why not? We don't have any plans, and it's supposed to be beautiful up there this time of year. Megan's tone was light, but there was an edge to it, a subtle urgency that Josh couldn't quite place. He hesitated, but only for a moment. Sure, sounds good. I could use a break from everything. Megan's smile returned, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Great, I'll pack us up in the morning and we can head out after breakfast. They finished dinner, and afterward, they curled up on the couch to watch a movie, but Josh's mind kept drifting. Megan seemed content, relaxed even, but there was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before. He wanted to ask if everything was okay, but he didn't want to ruin the night. He told himself that they were just in a bit of a rut, that this weekend away would be good for them. As the movie played on, Josh's thoughts wandered back to the missed call from earlier in the week. He hadn't given it much thought since then, but now, sitting next to Megan in the dim light of their living room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But he pushed the thought aside, convincing himself that he was just overthinking things. They'd go to the cabin, have a great weekend, and everything would be back to normal. The next morning, they set out early. The drive was picturesque, the landscape transforming from the suburban sprawl to the rolling hills and dense forests of the countryside. Megan seemed in high spirits, chatting about work and her plans for a new project she was excited about. Josh listened, happy to hear her enthusiasm, but there was still that nagging feeling in the back of his mind, like an itch he couldn't scratch. They arrived at the cabin just before noon. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth filling their lungs as they stepped out of the car. The cabin was as charming as ever, with its rustic wooden exterior and the small porch that overlooked a babbling brook. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you were 1,000,000 miles away from the rest of the world. Isn't it perfect? Megan said, taking a deep breath and stretching her arms out as if to embrace the surroundings. Yeah, it really is, Josh agreed, smiling at her. For a moment, the unease he'd been feeling dissipated. Maybe this was exactly what they needed. A little time away from everything to remind themselves of what was important. They spent the afternoon hiking through the woods, following a trail that led them to a small, secluded lake. The water was clear and still, reflecting the blue sky and the trees that lined the shore. They sat on a fallen log, skipping stones across the surface and talking about nothing in particular. It was peaceful, and Josh found himself relaxing, the tension in his shoulders easing as they basked in the tranquility of the moment. Megan seemed to be enjoying herself too, though there were moments when she would grow quiet, her gaze distant as if lost in thought. That night, they sat by the fire pit outside the cabin, wrapped in blankets as the flames crackled and popped. The stars were out in full force, a blanket of twinkling lights overhead. They didn't talk much, just enjoyed the silence and the warmth of the fire. But as they sat there, Josh couldn't help but notice that Megan was unusually quiet. She stared into the fire, her expression unreadable. He wanted to ask her what was on her mind, but something held him back. Maybe it was fear. Fear of what she might say, of what he might hear. Later, as they lay in bed, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls, Josh finally broke the silence. "Megan, is everything okay?" She turned to him, her eyes wide and startled, as if she hadn't expected the question. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" Josh searched her face, looking for any sign that she was hiding something. But all he saw was his wife, the woman he loved. He smiled, though it felt forced. "I don't know. I just wanted to make sure." Megan reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Everything's fine, Josh. I'm just tired, that's all. It's been a long week." He nodded, wanting to believe her. "Yeah, I guess we both are." They lay there in silence, holding hands, but Josh's mind was far from quiet. The unease was back, stronger now, like a dark cloud hovering just out of sight. He told himself he was being paranoid, that he was reading too much into things. But deep down, he knew that something was wrong. He just didn't know what. As sleep finally claimed him, Josh had no idea that the unanswered questions swirling in his mind were about to shatter the carefully constructed world he thought he knew. The storm was coming, and there would be no turning back. Josh had never felt more lost. In the days following their weekend at the cabin, Megan's behavior grew more erratic. She was more secretive, more distant, and no matter how hard Josh tried to bridge the growing chasm between them, it seemed to widen with each passing day. The woman he had once felt so deeply connected to now felt like a stranger sharing his home, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was a Wednesday evening when Josh finally decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had come home late from work, worn out from a long day of meetings and deadlines, but the moment he walked through the door, the tension in the air was palpable. Megan was in the kitchen, her back to him as she stared down at the counter, her phone in her hand. Josh watched her for a moment, noting the way her shoulders were hunched, the way she seemed so absorbed in whatever she was looking at on her phone. Normally, she would have greeted him, but tonight she hadn't even noticed him come in. "Megan?" he called out, stepping closer. She flinched, quickly locking her phone and setting it down as she turned to face him. "Oh, Josh, I didn't hear you come in." He studied her face, searching for any sign of the woman he had married, but all he saw was the mask she had been wearing for weeks. "Is everything okay?" Megan forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't it be?" Josh sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. You just seem distant lately." "I'm fine, really," she insisted, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or guilt. He couldn't be sure. He wanted to believe her, to take her at her word and push away the doubts that had been gnawing at him. But he couldn't. Not anymore. "Megan, if something's going on, you can tell me." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting away from his before she caught herself. "There's nothing going on, Josh. I've just been stressed, that's all." But Josh wasn't convinced. He could feel the lies hanging in the air between them, suffocating him. "Megan, Josh, please." She cut him off, her voice trembling. "Can we not do this right now? I'm tired, and I just want to go to bed." He opened his mouth to argue, to demand the truth, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She looked like she was on the verge of breaking down, and for a moment, his anger melted away, replaced by concern. "Okay," he said softly. "We'll talk tomorrow." Megan nodded, relief washing over her features, and without another word, she walked past him and headed upstairs. Josh stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the spot where she had been. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, none of which he could untangle. He knew something was wrong. He had known it for weeks, but the question was what to do about it. The next day, the situation only grew worse. Megan was up early, leaving the house before Josh had even woken up. She didn't leave a note or send a text, and when he called her, she didn't answer. By the time he got to work, his anxiety was through the roof. He couldn't focus on anything. His mind kept drifting back to Megan, to the way she had been acting, to the lies he knew she was telling. He tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the tasks at hand, but it was no use. At lunchtime, he received a text from an unknown number. "She's lying to you. If you want to know the truth, follow her tomorrow." Josh's heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to delete the message, to ignore it as some cruel joke, but something stopped him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was the answer he had been searching for, the key to understanding what had been happening between them. So, he made a decision. The next day, he would follow Megan and find out what she was hiding. The thought made him sick to his stomach, but he couldn't go on like this. He needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The following morning, he woke up early, his nerves on edge. Megan was already dressed when he came downstairs, sipping a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. "You're up early," she commented, not looking up from her phone. "Yeah, couldn't sleep," Josh replied, trying to sound casual. "What about you? Got a big day ahead?" "Just the usual," she said, but there was something off about her tone, something that made Josh's suspicions flare up. She left the house around 8 a.m., and Josh waited a few minutes before grabbing his keys and following her. His heart pounded in his chest as he tailed her car, keeping a safe distance. He felt like a criminal, like he was betraying her trust. But he reminded himself that she had betrayed him first. Megan's car wound through the city streets, eventually leaving the familiar roads of their neighborhood behind. Josh's mind raced as he tried to figure out where she was going. She drove for nearly an hour, taking a series of back roads that eventually led them into the countryside. There were fewer and fewer cars around, and the landscape became more rural, dotted with trees and rolling fields. Finally, she turned onto a narrow dirt road that led to a secluded area, hidden from view by a dense grove of trees. Josh slowed his car, parking it a safe distance away before getting out and following on foot. He crept through the underbrush, his heart in his throat, until he reached a spot where he could see her car parked ahead. Megan got out, glancing around as if to make sure she wasn't being followed. Josh held his breath, crouching down behind a bush, hoping she wouldn't see him. After a moment, she seemed satisfied and walked further into the trees. Josh waited until she was out of sight before following her again, staying low and moving as quietly as he could. He didn't have to go far before he heard voices. A man's voice, deep and familiar, followed by Megan's. His stomach dropped as he crept closer, peering through the foliage until he could see them. Megan was standing with her back to him, facing a tall man with dark hair. Josh's blood ran cold as he recognized him. Michael, an old friend of Megan's from college. They were talking in hushed tones, but Josh couldn't make out what they were saying. He moved a little closer, his heart pounding in his ears. "Can't keep doing this," Megan was saying, her voice strained. "It's not fair to him." "What about what's fair to us?" Michael replied, stepping closer to her. "I'm tired of sneaking around, Megan. I want to be with you." Josh felt like he'd been punched in the gut. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. There was no mistaking what was happening. Megan was having an affair. He wanted to scream, to run out and confront them, but he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, watching as the woman he loved betrayed him in the most painful way possible. Megan shook her head, tears in her eyes. "I know, Michael, but it's not that simple. I'm married. I can't just leave him." "But you don't love him," Michael said, his voice low and intense. "Not like you love me." Josh couldn't take it anymore. He stumbled backward, the sound of his footsteps startling both of them. Megan spun around, her eyes wide with shock when she saw him. "Josh," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Michael looked equally stunned, but Josh didn't care. He couldn't even look at him. His entire focus was on Megan. "How long?" Josh demanded, his voice trembling with anger. "How long has this been going on?" Megan's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. Josh could see the guilt written all over her face. "Answer me!" he shouted, his voice breaking. Megan flinched, but she finally spoke. "A few months," she admitted, her voice shaking. "It just happened, Josh. I didn't mean for it to." Josh felt like his world was collapsing around him. He had suspected, yes, but actually hearing the words was like a knife to the heart. "You didn't mean for it to?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You didn't mean to sleep with another man? To lie to me every day?" "I'm sorry," Megan sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want to hurt you, Josh. I love you, but—" "Don't," Josh cut her off, his voice cold and distant. "Don't you dare say you love me." Megan fell silent, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Michael started to say something, but Josh didn't even look at him. He couldn't stand the sight of either of them. Without another word, Josh turned and walked away, his heart shattered into a million pieces. Josh drove aimlessly for hours, the pain and anger churning inside him like a storm that wouldn't abate. He had replayed the scene in his mind countless times. Megan standing there with Michael, her betrayal laid bare for him to see. The woman he had trusted with his heart, his future, had torn it all apart in one fell swoop. He finally pulled into an empty parking lot, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting the world in shades of twilight. He rested his head against the steering wheel, the weight of what had happened pressing down on him until it felt like he could hardly breathe. How had they gotten to this point? How had he missed the signs, the warning signals that something was wrong? The truth was, he had seen them, but he had ignored them, convincing himself that everything was fine. But it hadn't been fine for a long time, and now the consequences of that denial were staring him in the face. Eventually, he forced himself to go home, though the thought of walking into the house he had shared with Megan, the place that was supposed to be their sanctuary, filled him with dread. But he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. He needed answers, even if they destroyed him. When he walked through the door, the house was dark and silent. Megan was sitting on the couch, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with fear and guilt. "Josh," she began, but he held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," he said, his voice flat. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I just want the truth." Megan's lower lip trembled, but she nodded. "I'll tell you everything." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the tension between them so thick it was almost suffocating. Josh braced himself for what was to come, knowing that whatever Megan was about to say would change everything. "It started a few months ago," Megan began, her voice shaky. "Michael and I reconnected on social media, and at first, it was just catching up, talking about old times. But then, things got more serious. I was feeling so disconnected from you, Josh, and Michael was there telling me everything I wanted to hear." Josh's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay silent, to let her continue. "I didn't plan for it to go this far," Megan continued, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you, but it just happened. I was lonely, and I thought maybe it would fill the void I was feeling, but it only made things worse." "So you kept lying to me?" Josh said bitterly. "You kept sneaking around with him, knowing what it would do to me if I found out?" Megan's eyes filled with tears again, but she nodded. "I was afraid, Josh. I was afraid of what would happen if you knew. I didn't want to lose you." "Well, you've lost me now," Josh snapped, the words cutting through the air like a knife. Megan flinched as if he had slapped her, her tears spilling over. "I'm so sorry, Josh," she sobbed. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I still love you, I swear." "Stop," Josh said, his voice shaking with anger and pain. "Just stop. You don't get to say that after what you've done." Megan fell silent, her sobs echoing in the empty room. Josh could feel the last remnants of his control slipping away, the anger and hurt bubbling to the surface, threatening to consume him. "You threw everything away," he said, his voice hoarse. "For what? For some fling with an old boyfriend? We were supposed to be building a life together, Megan. We were supposed to be a family." At the mention of family, Megan's expression changed. Her face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands, crying even harder. Josh's stomach twisted with dread. "What else aren't you telling me?" he demanded, his heart pounding in his chest. Megan didn't respond immediately, her sobs making it difficult for her to speak. But finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a pain that matched his own. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words hit Josh like a sledgehammer. For a moment, he couldn't process them, couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What?" "I'm pregnant," Megan repeated, tears streaming down her face. "But Josh, it's not yours. The baby is Michael's." Josh felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. The room spun, and he had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling over. It was too much pain, too much betrayal. He couldn't handle it. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, this can't be happening." "I'm so sorry," Megan cried, reaching out for him, but he pulled away, unable to stand the sight of her. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Josh. I was confused. I was lost." "Stop," Josh said, his voice trembling. "Just stop talking." He couldn't listen to her excuses anymore, couldn't bear to hear her try to justify what she had done. She had not only destroyed their marriage, but had also created a life with another man. A life that would forever be a reminder of her betrayal. Josh stood up feeling like he was going to be sick. He needed to get out of there, needed to put as much distance between himself and Megan as possible. "I can't do this," he said, his voice shaking. "I need to leave." "Josh, please," Megan begged, but he didn't listen. He turned and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind him. He got into his car and drove, not knowing where he was going, only knowing that he couldn't stay there, couldn't stay with her. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, pain, betrayal, heartbreak. He couldn't think straight, couldn't process everything that had just happened. He drove for what felt like hours, the city lights blurring together as he sped down the highway. Eventually, he pulled over to the side of the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. The realization hit him all at once. His marriage was over. The life he had been building with Megan was gone, shattered by her lies and betrayal. And now, she was carrying another man's child. Josh buried his face in his hands, letting out a guttural cry of anguish. He had never felt so broken, so completely and utterly destroyed. How was he supposed to move on from this? How was he supposed to pick up the pieces of his life when everything he had known was gone? He didn't know how long he sat there, crying until he had no tears left. Eventually, he pulled himself together, wiping his face and taking a few deep breaths. He needed to figure out what to do next, needed to find a way to move forward. But how could he? How could he ever trust anyone again, after what Megan had done to him? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't stay with her. He couldn't be a part of her life anymore, not after everything that had happened. With a heavy heart, Josh started the car and headed back toward the house. When he arrived, Megan was sitting on the front steps, her face buried in her hands. She looked up when she heard the car, her eyes swollen from crying. "Josh," she said, standing up as he approached. "I'm so sorry. Please, we can work this out." "No," Josh said firmly, cutting her off. "We can't work this out, Megan. It's over." Megan's face crumpled and she reached out for him, but he stepped back, shaking his head. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't be with you, not after what you've done." "Please," Megan begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't leave me. I love you, Josh. I made a mistake, but we can get through this." Josh felt a surge of anger at her words. How could she still say she loved him after everything? How could she expect him to forgive her? "It's too late," he said, his voice cold and distant. "You made your choice, Megan. Now you have to live with the consequences." He turned and walked away, ignoring her cries as she begged him to stay. He didn't look back, didn't allow himself to falter. He had made his decision, and he knew it was the right one, no matter how much it hurt. As he drove away from the house for the last time, Josh felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with the overwhelming sadness that threatened to consume him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't stay trapped in the past, in the pain of Megan's betrayal. It would take time, time to heal, time to rebuild his life. But one day, he would be okay again. One day, he would find peace. And as he drove into the unknown, leaving his old life behind, Josh made a promise to himself. He would find a way to move forward, to create a new life, one that was free from the lies and the heartbreak that had torn his world apart. He didn't know how long it would take or where the journey would lead him, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never let anyone break him like this again. And with that resolve, Josh faced the future, ready to take the first step on the long road to recovery, leaving the past and Megan behind him for good.